in person.
Absolutely.
That would be a fun event. All right, well, look, why don't we go ahead and get started? Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us tonight. My name's Russell Moore. I work on the USS Hornet Museum here. I'm very excited to virtually welcome author Ian Toll to talk to us about his new novel, The Twilight of the Gods, tonight. The format that we're going to use tonight is that we're going to start off talking a little bit about the book for a few minutes, but we want to spend the bulk of the time having Ian answer your questions. And so if you just type in any questions that you have into the comments, we're going to be collecting them and asking them as we go along. And you don't need to wait until we get to the question section. If you want to start typing your questions in now, we'll start collecting them. Just so you know, in the description of the event, there is a link. We have copies of Ian's new book signed in our online store, which you can order. And so please do that if you're interested. And then let me just give a little bit of background. Ian Toll is a well-known author of 4 highly regarded books of American military history: 6 Frigates, Pacific Crucible, The Conquering Tide, and the latest one, Twilight of the Gods. The last 3 books make up a trilogy about the Pacific War that he's been writing. Ian has won numerous awards. He's been widely published in newspapers and magazines. He's spoken at venues and institutions including the Pentagon, the Treasury Department, the National World War II Museum, U.S. Naval Academy, and now the USS Hornet. With that, I can turn it over to you, Ian, for your opening remarks.
Yeah, thank you, Russell. I really appreciate doing this. I've done many of these virtual events in the last 2 weeks since the book was published. And it's unfortunate that we can't be together in person. I would obviously prefer that, but this is what's available to us, and I'm grateful that we have, through this technology, the ability to at least have this sort of virtual presence as we talk about the book. As you said, Russell, we wanted to leave the vast majority of our time together for questions and answers, but I'll just speak very briefly about the project. I had published my first book, 6 Frigates, in 2006. That was a history of the founding of the Navy between the period of the American Revolution and the War of 1812. And I, wasn't really even committed to becoming an author as a career at that point. I had envisioned that book as essentially a one-time project. It was something that I wanted to write. It was in the period after 9/11 when I just felt that I had to do something different from what I had been doing up to that point. And so I wrote a first chapter, and to my surprise, the book was picked up by a publisher, WWII Norton, came out in 2006, and it was kind of an unexpected success, both in terms of the reviews and also the sales. And so my editor asked me if I'd be interested in writing another book, and I said, well, I had always been especially fascinated with the Pacific War, and in many ways I thought, although you were jumping forward 170 years in time, in some ways the Pacific War was like a bookend to 6 Frigates, because the course that the nation took, and particularly in our relationship as a country with the sea that was established in that early part of our history, it kind of came to a culmination during the Pacific War, when the United States became the sole kind of naval superpower, and had won this largest of all naval wars in history, the only sea war that has ever been fought across the entire breadth of the Pacific Ocean, which is, of course, our largest ocean, and an ocean so large that you could fit all of the world's land masses into it with room to spare. And so I thought that was the logical next step. And my editor very kindly said, I'll give you a book contract today if you agree to write a book about the Pacific War. And so I set out to write a 1-volume history of this war. In retrospect, I think it was, I mean, I can hardly even imagine what I was thinking that I could do this in one volume. And I set out and began writing, and I had something in the order of about 800 pages. And I had only gotten through the Battle of Midway, which we were talking about that battle just before we went live. That's 6 months into a 44-month war. That's just 6 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor. And so it was a sort of a Houston, we have a problem kind of moment. And I called my editor, and he was kind enough to say, without even asking to see the pages I'd written, we'll turn it into a trilogy. And so the contract was amended, and that's what I've been doing now for really 14 years, if you include the research time. The first book, the first volume, Pacific Crucible, was published in 2011. That covered the initial 6 months of the war, from Japan's surprise raid on Pearl Harbor to the American counterpunch at Midway. Volume 2, The Conquering Tide, was published in 2015. That told the story of the middle 2 years of the Pacific War, when the Allied counteroffensive swept up from the South Pacific and through the Central Pacific, culminating in the battle for the Marianas Islands and the accompanying naval battle that occurred, the Battle of the Philippine Sea. And then this volume, Twilight of the Gods, is the third and last. This picks up after the Marianas campaign in mid-1944 and tells the story of the last year of the war through the Japanese surrender in August 1945. And of course, like every other aspect of World War II, Pacific War has been covered. It's been written about. It's an enormous literature. You were showing me just virtually a book on the Battle of Midway that was published in 1944. And so when I set out to do this, I had to overcome some doubts in my own mind about what more could be added to this tremendous literature. But as I got further into the research, I became increasingly confident that there really was a new approach to take in telling the story of this vast and bloody war. As large as the World War II literature is, it's very lopsided in many different respects. The war in Europe has received much more attention than the war in the Pacific, and the disparity is striking, even in relative to the size of the two conflicts. And I found that studies of the Allied High Command and the decisions that were made at the highest levels of the Allied governments concerning the war in Europe and in the Pacific has never quite succeeded in pulling together really a convincing across the board account of the decisions that were made affecting the Pacific theater. The Second World War, we use the singular, really it was two wars that just happened to occur at the same time. And no matter how much you know about what happened in Europe, no matter how many books you read, no matter how many years you spend digging through archives, you really can't count yourself an expert on the Pacific unless you really spend your time learning what happened in the Pacific. And, as distinct from what happened in Europe. And this should seem like an obvious point, but, we have a tendency to sort of categorize people as World War II experts. And many of those World War II experts know more than I'll ever know about the war against Hitler. And yet it's extraordinary how much you can know about what happened in Europe and still know virtually nothing or have a very, very limited understanding of what happened in the Pacific. As I look at this literature, I find that there has been a tendency to concentrate and to specialize in certain aspects of the conflict. And so the literature has grown very rich, the scholarship has grown very rich. And yet there also is this tendency to focus on individual aspects of the war. So individual battles, biographies of individual commanders, subjects, the Navy, the Army, the certain types of weapons. You have others that are looking at the big decisions that were made in the highest echelons. You have the whole scope of focus on the Japanese, Western scholars of Japan, Japanese scholars whose work has appeared in translation increasingly in recent decades, the translation of original sources of various kinds. And so the literature has grown richer and richer, and yet you've had this stay in your lane mentality led to a kind of an increasing sort of disjointed piecemeal development of the scholarship. And so all of that is just a long-winded way of saying that I think we've had a lack of well-integrated narratives about the Pacific War in its entirety. And so what I've set out to do in this trilogy is to try to tell the whole story, constantly moving from one perspective to another. And the metaphor I like to use is if you were studying a complex three-dimensional object and you had the ability to walk around it and look at it from different angles, that's how I kind of envision the narrative. I want to constantly be shifting perspectives and looking at this subject from different angles and different perspectives to gain a deeper understanding of what happened in the Pacific. And so this approach merges the high strategic considerations with the realm of politics, foreign policy, and in this last year of the war, looking forward to the construction of a stable post-war, peaceful international order in Asia. So what was happening in the halls of power in Washington and Tokyo, where the great questions of strategy and diplomacy were being decided. I want to tell that story, but then to juxtapose that to the story of the war on the front lines, in the foxholes, on the decks of the ships, in the cockpits of the airplanes, and then shifting as well frequently to Tokyo and trying to provide a glimpse of what the war was like for ordinary Japanese people as the bombing raids began, as the real suffering of the last year of the war became very acute, but then also to tell a coherent story drawing upon the best and most recent scholarship about how the Japanese regime was making decisions, or in this case, avoiding decisions until finally, in the last phase of this war, literally in the last 2 weeks of the war, events forced this broken, dysfunctional Japanese militarist regime to break its deadlock and to finally recognize the need to accept surrender on Allied terms. And so really this is the last year of the war when both sides know at the highest level, even in Japan, both sides have recognized that Japan has lost the war. And yet there is a difference between defeat and surrender. And this a really awful conflict, which resulted in something like 1.5 million Japanese deaths, and the deaths of tens of thousands of Americans and Allied soldiers, sailors, Marines, airmen, in the last 12 months of this conflict, were really fought over the issue of, would the Japanese recognize that they had blundered by starting this war, and that the only way to escape the war was to accept the necessity for unconditional surrender, followed by essentially a reconstruction of their society under the supervision of the Allied powers. And so I think I've probably gone on about long enough, and I really would like to entertain any questions that our virtual audience may have. And thanks very much for showing up to this event.
That was a great and interesting overview. Yes, I think not everybody thinks about the war in that perspective. I do have a nice pile of questions here that we're getting. So why don't I just jump right in? So Stuart Hansen asks, what was the most difficult part of writing this book?
Well, I think, George Orwell said, writing a book is an exhausting and a horrible struggle, like a long bout of some painful illness. And, I don't think I could have done it if I didn't have the fact that I had a book contract with the publisher and was contractually obligated to produce this piece of work. And yeah, it's hard going. Writing is hard work. And so, what was the single hardest thing? I think it's figuring out when you have enough. So I love doing the research. I love doing the research because there's just a thrill that comes with digging through the archives in some place like the National Archives, in Washington, or the Hoover archives down at Stanford in Palo Alto, you know, and looking through these original documents and finding something really fascinating, and knowing that no one else has used it, or being almost certain that no one else has used it. And then, of course, the research, continuing the research becomes a way to avoid writing as well. And so, you know, figuring out when you have enough to begin writing, I think that comes down to a judgment call. I've become a little bit better at that, a little bit more adept over the years that I've been doing this now. This is my fourth book. Facing up to the need to sort of sit down, face the blank page, and just do the kind of very, very difficult, draining work of producing good prose. That's a challenge, and it's one that I feel very happy to have met that challenge and overcome it in this case.
Great. So this next question, there's been a couple of versions of this question. It's similar to a question I was thinking of myself. So Kevin McKee asks, what is the most interesting thing you learned while researching this book?
Well, you know, there's so many ways I could answer that, but you know, I'll just pick one. I was fortunate 5 years ago that the descendants of the grandson of General Robert C. Richardson contacted me through my website and said, would you like my grandfather's diary? Now, you know, Robert Richardson was the commanding general of Army forces in Hawaii. So he was the Army's top guy in Nimitz's theater, which was the northern half of the Pacific. And Richardson kept a, you know, extremely illuminating diary. Almost every day he wrote in his diary, and he wrote very, very frankly about some of the internal military politics that were going on. So I felt very fortunate to be able to see this diary. I think I was the first one to see it. Now it's available. General Richardson had willed his descendants to keep it private until 2015, because there's a lot in there that's, you know, in some ways embarrassing, or at least openly critical, particularly the Navy. During the command summit in July 1944, when General Douglas Macarthur traveled from Australia to Hawaii to meet with FDR, who also traveled there from the mainland, and with Nimitz and with Admiral Leahy. That meeting, which was perhaps the single most important command summit of the Pacific War, has been somewhat perplexing to historians because there were no minutes kept of these meetings. No staff members were allowed to remain in the room. You just had these four principals, Macarthur, Nimitz, FDR, and Leahy, who were hashing out some of the most far-reaching decisions of the war, decisions that affected not only the last year of the war, but also the future of Asia. And historians and biographers have been forced to rely on the kind of first and secondhand recollection of the four participants. And of course, FDR died very suddenly, didn't say anything, wrote no memoir, wrote no diary, you know, left no direct record. And then Leahy and Nimitz were both fairly retiring, reticent types, who also never made a real record of what was said. You can glean it through, you know, some of the cables Nimitz has sent, through a memorandum Leahy wrote. Leahy touched upon it in his memoir. But Macarthur, when he published his memoir in the mid-60s, he reconstructed the whole scene, quoting himself at length, and wrote a very kind of entertaining account, also very self-serving. And so that's really shaped the way that historians have viewed that summit. Well, along comes Richardson's diary in 2015, and lo and behold, Macarthur stayed with Richardson at his house in Fort Shafter and debriefed him each night in detail, explaining what had happened. And so this is an immensely important new source, which alters the perspective quite a bit about exactly what was said, and basically places Macarthur's account in, I think, in serious doubt, or gives us reason to be seriously skeptical of it. So anyway, all of it is laid out. It's in the first chapter of the book, and I won't go on about it anymore, but that certainly was a really interesting and illuminating thing that I learned.
Okay, wow, that's fascinating. Got the just the luck of, I mean, not luck. I'm sure they heard that you were writing
Oh
this and
no, it's
offered it
luck.
to you.
It was
That's
luck for
amazing.
sure. To have been for the Richardson family to have just reached out to me, I felt very fortunate.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Bill Shepard wants to ask a question about your research methods. You talked about it a little bit, but maybe you can elaborate. He says, could you describe the research methods you use and comment on the travel that you had to do to track down some of your sources?
Well, I dug it up in archives. The National Archives in Washington, the U.S. Navy Archives at the Washington Navy Yard, the Marine Corps Archives in Quantico, Virginia, the National War College Archives in Newport. I mentioned the Hoover Archives, which there's some terrific stuff right there in the Bay Area at Stanford. And there are probably some others that I've forgotten, but it was a lot of just traveling to these places and sitting down and going through the documents. And, as I said earlier, I love doing this. And I find that I can be very productive while I'm doing it, because it's just something that kind of keeps me interested, turning these pages, looking at these things, and immediately seeing how I may be able to use them in the narrative. And so it was a lot of archival work, and of course it was interviews with World War II veterans. I feel very, very fortunate to be really probably among the very last generation of World War II historians who will be able to rely on the direct eyewitness testimonies of those who were there. We've just passed the 75th anniversary of the end of the war. You can look forward 25 years to the 100th anniversary, and between now and then, that living link will be severed, so that by the time we get to the, I hope to eat my vegetables and be around in 2045. I hope that I am. And if I am, it will be certain at that point, looking back at the Second World War, we'll be very much in the same position that we are today, looking back on the Civil War, in that, there is no living memory anymore. These events have passed into history, and all of us will absorb these events entirely through studying events that took place before our time, which is a little different than when you can interact with people, including some of the docents on the Hornet, I should say. When I visited there frequently during my research, you had a number of World War II veterans who were able to speak directly to their experience serving on carriers, not the Hornet, directly on other carriers.
Yeah, we had Mickey Ganich, who's a Pearl Harbor survivor, that spoke at the ship last year on Veterans Day, and it was his 100th birthday. And so that gets to the point of what you're talking about. Speaking of docents, I have a question for one of our docents, Chuck Myers. So he wants to ask a more military question. And he says, was Midway the turning point of the war, or was it FDR's speech on December 8th, 1941?
Well, I've argued that if there was a turning point, it really was Pearl Harbor. I think you can argue that Pearl Harbor was the turning point of the entire Second World War. It was the event that really sealed the fates of not just Japan, but also Nazi Germany, by bringing the United States into the war, united and determined to win it. In general, we've had this question: what was the turning point? The strategic bombing survey interrogators, when we went into Tokyo after the war, that was a question that they asked all of the Tokyo generals and admirals that they interrogated. What did you guys think the turning point was? It's a bit esoteric, but I asked the question, is it necessary to say there was a turning point in the Pacific War? Maybe it's described, maybe the war is described more in a sense of an arc. You look at an arc, there's no turning point in the arc. The entire thing is a turning point. Maybe that's a better way to think about the Pacific War. When a python wraps a victim, a man gets wrapped by a python crushes the life out of him. What's the turning point in that fight? It's steady pressure, which leads to an inevitable result. That's the kind of the determinist view of the Pacific War, and I think I find myself in that camp. This country had something like 10 times the latent military industrial strength of the Japanese. The Japanese picked a fight with us in a way that would enrage us as a nation. And at that point, it was pretty clear what was going to happen. How long would it take? How many battles would be fought? Which of those battles would be won or lost? All of that was uncertain. But it was fairly certain that we were going to conquer and subjugate Japan as of December 7th, 1941, in my view.
Yep, I think that makes a lot of sense. Here's a simple question. Heidi Shave is from our education department. She wants to know, who is your favorite general or admiral?
Well, you know, I suppose if I had to pick one, you know, I probably would pick Chester Nimitz. I know many others would as well. He was a remarkable person. He, you know, had the ability to lead this this kind of team of rivals. You know, his vast theater command, which took in like a fifth of the Earth's surface. He was the theater commander with authority over the Army Air Forces, all branches of the Navy, of course, and the Marine Corps. And there was a lot of dissension within that camp. And yet he was able to kind of get them working together to pick themselves up after the shattering blow of the attack on Pearl Harbor, and was in many ways a remarkable leader. He revealed his aspects of his character that maybe weren't apparent at the beginning as the war went on. There was a streak of ruthlessness in Nimitz, which I think is an aspect of his genius. He was sort of reticent in the sense that he often wanted everyone to talk before he would render a decision. He was content to listen more than he spoke in meetings at his headquarters. And yet on several occasions that you can show, you know, where he made a bold decision overruling many of his leading advisors, and that decision was vindicated. That happened in many cases through the war. So Chester Nimitz, yes, would be the one that I would choose.
So here's a unintentional follow-up. So Mike Harkle Road is another docent, and he asks, how much did the Nimitz Sink Pack war diaries add to your knowledge of the Pacific War?
Well, quite a bit. I went through every page of those those diaries, and you know, that's a source that historians and biographers have been using for decades, and yet there was a lot in there that was a surprise to me. And you know, there's so many examples that you know, I hesitate to choose one, but I will choose one. There are communications in there regarding the attack on Peleliu, which was in the Palau Islands. This was a controversial, in retrospect, a controversial operation. We took an island. It was a bloody battle, terrible battle. The 1st Marine Division really took heavy losses in the conquest of that island. And Bull Halsey had advocated bypassing it, and Nimitz had overruled him. But in the course of those discussions, there had been serious talk of reorienting that entire attack northward toward Iwo Jima. And if I could get in a time machine and go back in time, I would tell Chester Nimitz, absolutely do that. Skip Peleliu, take Iwo Jima now. If they had skipped Peleliu, many of those lives may have been saved, would have been saved. Also by taking Iwo Jima in September 1944 instead of February 1945, when the Japanese had time to reinforce the garrison and to dig fortifications on that island. That could have been a walkover as opposed to the terrible, costly, bloody battle that it was.
Okay, that's interesting. Yes, I hear a lot about the Battle of Peleliu, and it's easy to look back in time and call it controversial. Okay, so I have a couple of people that asked multiple questions, so I'm getting to some of the second questions from some of these people. Stuart Hanson asks, what part of World War II do you think still has the most fertile ground for authors to explore?
Well, again, many ways to answer that, but I think that the information and propaganda war is one that could be better understood. You know, we associate propaganda with the Nazis above all. You know, Goebbels' outfit was perhaps the most far-reaching, most megalomaniacal attempt to control all of the information sources flowing to the German people. And yet, you know, we had versions of that same sort of management of information in the United States, in the Allied combatant nations as well. And the way that our government attempted to shape the way that the American people thought about the war, and at the same time to influence the way in which foreign peoples, including enemy peoples and also neutral countries, thought about the United States, seemed to me to be vitally important, and a really important part of the story of the American and Allied victory in that war was our ability to not just win the war, but to convince so many people around the world, including even the enemy populations, Japanese in this case, that our winning was a good thing, and that our winning opened the way to a sort of a better future. That seemed to me to be very, very important, and it's an interesting story. It's one in which you had really some of the smartest people in the United States who, you know, were focused on how to develop those messages, and so I think that's propaganda and information is an aspect of the conflict that I think there's more work to be done on.
Interesting. Yep. So Chuck Myers, our docent, has got his second question in. I think he's revealing a little bit of his bias in the way he words his question, but I'll read it as written anyways. He says, suppose there was no dugout Doug in the Pacific. For those of you that don't know, that's a nickname for Macarthur. How would that have changed things, better or worse for the Allies?
Well, historians have been hard on Macarthur, and I've held to that tradition largely in this book and in the series. I've been pretty rough on him as well. You can criticize a number of the command decisions that he made. You can also focus on this kind of certain unbecoming character traits, certain deceitfulness, egoism, narcissism, a love of publicity, a willing to subvert the authority of both the Army and of the US government in many cases that eventually led to him being dismissed by Harry Truman. If you'd taken Macarthur out of the war and placed, say, just a low-key but competent American general in his shoes, I think that the Philippines would not have loomed as large in the way that we thought about the war. The Philippines were really the absolute centerpiece of MacArthur's war. From the day that he was ordered to leave the Philippines by FDR, placed in charge of Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific, it really was his single-minded, monomaniacal focus was to return to the Philippines, liberate the entire archipelago, free his army from captivity. And that was very natural for him to feel oriented that way. But of course, as many others continually reminded MacArthur, including George Marshall, including the Navy leaders, many of the planners in Washington, the real objective of the war in the Pacific was to defeat Japan. And if Japan was defeated, then the Philippines would be liberated as a matter of course. And so I think it is possible, it's hard to argue the counterfactual, but I think it's possible that we would not have returned to the Philippines in the way that we did, and that there might have been a greater emphasis on the Central Pacific campaign, and an earlier attempt to kind of close the ring around Japan's inner ring of defenses around its home islands.
Essentially island hopped past the Philippines as a giant island skip. Just as an aside, Stuart Hansen says, fascinating answer, thank you. And that was the question where you answered about information and propaganda. So he enjoyed your answer. So here's a question from Dale De Rossi. He said, so much is written about code breakers of England in Europe and the US and the Pacific. What capabilities do the Japanese have?
The Japanese capabilities were pretty limited in code breaking, and that really never became a vital consideration at any point in the war. I think they relied to a great degree on traffic analysis. You know, they certainly were diligent about listening in on any plain language transmissions. And so, you know, on numerous occasions in, say, like in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the coded transmissions between the American forces became so backed up just because of the volume of radio traffic in this large, complex battle that was occurring, that there were a number of times when you had plain language transmissions simply to speed the process of getting the message through. And the Japanese were always very good at listening to those and attempting to act on them. And it was a tribute, I suppose, to the number of people they had who had English language skills. And then while I'm on the subject, there was also this very common phenomenon where you would have Japanese literally breaking in on radio transmissions and speaking in English, sometimes trying to fool our forces into thinking that there was an order. So you'd have a Japanese voice speaking in English purporting to order the American planes to return to the carrier, for example. That happened again and again. It was frequent, really. But on the whole, they had nothing like the capabilities that we had to actually apply cryptanalysis to try to break into codes.
Okay, interesting. So let's see, Kevin McKee, I think this is his second question. He said, what is the most underappreciated thing you have found while writing your World War II books? I'm guessing that means underappreciated about World War II, perhaps?
Well, I mean, I think that question calls for a pretty broad answer. And so, you know, I'll just make the point that I often make about the Pacific War, which is that, you know, we are a continental country, the United States. And like many continental countries, we tend to think about warfare as primarily being armies fighting on land. And of course, many of our wars have been that, our Revolutionary War, our Civil War. You know, these were wars in which the great contests, the big decisions were achieved on the battlefield. And operations at sea really had a supporting role. And that was true in World War I, it was true in World War II in Europe. But when it comes to the Pacific, you really just need to look at a map of the Pacific to grasp the point. After the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the principal strategic problem we had was to establish control of the sea. And in order to do that, we had to hunt down and destroy the Japanese Navy. So it was a sea war and an air war before it was anything else. And fighting on land, which occurred in the Pacific, tended to be the supporting operation. So you need to invert that kind of understanding when you come to the Pacific War. Think of it as a war at sea, a war in the air, and a war in which, to the extent that we had armies or marine divisions fighting on land, it was to support that bigger sea and air campaign. And so I don't know if that's surprising or not, but I think that that's a vital point, one that you really should begin with when you approach the subject of the Pacific War.
Yep, interesting. Kevin also asks, and this maybe is similar to the Heidi question, who was the most interesting character of the war in the Pacific? You said who your favorite Admiral was, but this could be a different answer. The most interesting character.
Well, I suppose you would throw out a bunch of names. I mean, Macarthur is a fascinating character. Douglas Macarthur is an absolutely fascinating character. He's the kind of person that, you know, great novelists have taken on as their challenge to try to plumb the psychological depths of someone like that, someone with tremendous talent. I mean, what do we ask of our military leaders? We ask, above all, that they have brains and that they have courage. And Macarthur was brilliant, first in his class at West Point. One of the most decorated, if not the most decorated officer of the First World War, American officer. You know, just an extraordinary record of battlefield courage. And then despite all of the counts against him, and I get into those, you know, in great detail in these books, he also was the single Allied military commander in the Pacific, I think, who best understood the larger context of this war, which was, you know, a struggle between competing ideas. And Macarthur was an idealist in many ways. And this idea of the democratic model, the universal values that underlay kind of the European Enlightenment and our concepts of our Constitution, our Declaration of Independence, that these were values that were worth fighting for, and that the Asian peoples would be willing to see as potentially their own values as well. He saw the importance of winning that struggle of ideas as well as the contest of arms. And that largely explains, I think, what is almost universally recognized as his great success as the Allied commander of occupation forces in Japan after the war, when he essentially single-handedly kind of oversaw the reconstruction of a democratic Japan. So yeah, I choose Macarthur. I mean, I could mention many others. I think Raymond Spruance is a fascinating character. I've mentioned Nimitz. I think Halsey is also very interesting. And in many ways, if you look at the leading naval commanders in the Pacific, what's extraordinary is that they all had essentially the same background, right? I mean, they had every admiral in the Navy in the Second World War had been through Annapolis. So they had all been subsumed in this culture from the age of 17, 18 years old. And yet, having gone through this culture that was in many ways designed to sort of shape them to be similar, they were very, very different. And no two, I think, admirals, you know, better make that point than Halsey and Spruance, who alternated in the same job, essentially as the supreme seagoing commander, commanding the Pacific Fleet at sea during the last year of the war. And yet, really, can you think of two more different characters than Spruance and Halsey? And so somehow this culture was able to produce very, very different types of commanders who were able to rise to the top echelon. And that I find very interesting as well.
So I'm going to skip to this question because I think it builds on what you were just talking about. Keith, you asked. Keith is one of the crew members here. He asked, can you comment on the contributions of Admiral John McCain? Obviously,
yes.
The first one.
McCain was a very senior admiral during the war. This is John Sidney McCain, the senator's grandfather, who was one of what they called the Johnny-come-latelys to aviation. So as I believe his rank was captain, and he was something like 50 years old, he went into flight training. So this would have been in the early 1930s, I believe. And there were others who did the same thing. Halsey did it. Ernest King did it. But you had this phenomenon of officers who had already reached a certain level of seniority, really were on the threshold of making flag rank, who went through flight training with these young ensigns right out of Annapolis. The reason they did that was because the Navy had, I think wisely, said that no one can skipper a carrier unless they are an aviator. And so these guys, these 50-year-olds went and learned how to fly just so they could earn that qualification, go on to skipper aircraft carriers. So Mccain was in that group. He was a very appealing figure personally. I've got a lot of stories about him in this book. And he was the one of the commanders of the carrier task force, the fast carrier task force, which was Task Force 58 when Spruance had it, Task Force 38 when Halsey had it. Mccain was Halsey's partner. He commanded the fast carriers under Halsey in the last year of the war. He made a number of significant mistakes, and actually he was to be relieved of command at the end of the war. The war ended before that could happen. And then very tragically, after attending the surrender ceremony aboard the Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2nd, 1945, he flew directly back and at his home in San Diego just a few days later died of a heart attack. And so the war basically wore him out completely. And you know, what more can I say about McCain? He was a really important part of what our forces did in that war, and he conducted himself, you know, with a great honor, and began the McCain family tradition that continued rather remarkably through 3 generations.
Wonder the perseverance. Did they just hang on until the end of the war, and then, you know, that's it? So the like you said, he wore himself out, but he somehow held on to that. Right?
If I could interject, I've actually read that he asked to skip the ceremony and took the
That's
day.
right.
He was so tired.
Oh,
And Halsey said, no, you got to be there.
oh, okay.
That's right.
Maybe
That's
that's it.
exactly right. Yep. He wanted to go home right after the surrender. Yep.
So so we are, let's see, 6:51. We're still doing okay here. Bill Shepard has a larger question. How did FDR and the Joint Chiefs handle the competing demands of the 2 wars, you know, the Pacific versus the European theater?
Well, we had actually agreed with the British even before the attack on Pearl Harbor that in the event that we entered the war, so this was in a series of conferences in early 1941 with the British, secret conferences. We had agreed that if we did enter the war, that we were going to prioritize the war against Hitler over the war against Japan. And I think that was the Europe First policy. I think that was the right policy. I think virtually every objective military historian or analyst agrees that it was. Dwight D. Eisenhower wrote in his memoir that he thought no serious student of military history ever questioned the Europe First policy. That was essentially a dig at Macarthur, because Macarthur was the only senior Allied commander who publicly questioned, and in fact said it was a historic folly to focus on the war in Europe over that of Japan. That said, so we had this basic policy that we were going to try to defeat Hitler first. We were going to devote most of our effort to defeating Hitler before defeating Japan. That once Germany was vanquished, the defeat of Japan would become inevitable. And yet, having agreed to that policy, there was a lot of interpretation and debate over what it meant exactly. And, you know, what is a minority of our effort that we're going to go to use in the Pacific? Is that 10% of our total effort? Or is it 30? That's, of course, an enormous difference. And were we able to commence a counteroffensive against Japan in the Pacific while Germany was still fighting? Or did we need to fight, as the British preferred, some sort of a simply defensive kind of holding operation with no counteroffensive until Germany fell? And these were really quite virulent arguments that we had between the Americans and the British, between the theater commanders in the Pacific and the Joint Chiefs in Washington, between the services. The service rivalries came into it. And so essentially, I think this is a complicated question, but essentially what happened was the American economy proved to be large enough and fruitful enough, productive enough, that we were able to fight all of these wars at the same time. We were able to defeat Hitler with the help of our allies. We were able to launch not just one, but two parallel counteroffensives in the Pacific in 1942 and 1943. We were able to equip the Navy to defeat the Japanese Navy. We were able to give Macarthur enough forces to return and liberate the Philippines, which was his great goal. We were able to deploy the B-29s to demonstrate really in the most complete possible fashion the possibilities of strategic bombing. We were able to deploy enough submarines to destroy Japan's merchant marine. We were able to do all of these things, essentially. So in many ways, the sheer size of the mobilized American economy made it unnecessary for these arguments to become really sort of critical. In a sense, we didn't have to settle those arguments. We could sort of let everyone fight the war they wanted to fight. And that's what
staggering, actually, when you think about it.
Yeah.
Okay, how are you doing? We're about 6:55 my time, it's about 9:55 your time. I still have a pretty good stack of questions if you want to keep going, but I know we agreed with an hour for you, so you let me know how you're doing.
I'm happy to keep going, sure. Yeah.
Okay, so here's a question from Wahida Rashid, and full disclosure, this is my wife, so this is good, she's watching. She says, did your research reveal any unique contributions of female members of the U.S. Navy during the Pacific War that you can remember and or care to share?
Well, of course we, had vital contributions from women. This was really the first time that in a big way we had women serving in uniform during the Second World War. And of course, the critical role that women played in the war in providing a labor for the war industries to mobilize the economy in the way that we've just been talking about. This is another one of these questions where, I have to just pick one answer, and so I'll do that. During the development of the B-29 Super Fortress, the giant Boeing 4-engine bomber that, kind of had this extraordinary range, extraordinary weight carrying capability, was a totally new and a different kind of a weapon. But the US government and Boeing had really rushed this airplane into service in a way that in many ways was pretty rash. And so the early prototypes of this aircraft, and even after it went into service, there were a lot of problems with it. With the result that there were a lot of crashes happening, even in training crashes in the United States. It was a dangerous airplane to fly in the early stages. And a training commander in Nebraska was finding that a lot of these young flyers were resisting some of the missions and complaining about the danger involved. The Army Air Forces had trained a number of female pilots who were mainly used in shuttling airplanes between bases at home rather than in combat roles overseas. But he saw an opportunity to sort of put these young flyers to shame. And so what he did without telling anyone is he had all women air crews bring a number of these new super fortresses in to land at that base. And so these planes came in, and you had the airmen and the pilots that were there in the kind of barracks watching. These planes came in, and then you had the all women crews get off the planes and sort of wave and go jump in a car and drive away. And the effect was, of course, to sort of shame these male pilots and airmen into realizing what these women seemed so comfortable flying this airplane. Maybe we need to stop complaining about the risks. And I thought that was a terrific story to sort of turn those gender stereotypes into a sort of productive way of sort of applying psychological pressure in a way that it did some good.
Interesting. I've never heard that. Okay, let's see here. So Stuart Hansen, he asks, we don't hear a lot about US subs in the Pacific. How important were they? I think I kind of know the answer to that question, but go ahead.
Well, they were vital, and if you haven't heard a lot about subs in the Pacific, I think that's partly because they really fought their own war, and so you know to the extent that the submarines coordinated with the rest of the fleet was somewhat limited. They had scouting, certain scouting roles in some battles, but by and large, what the Pacific submarine fleet did and what it did best was essentially attack the economic foundations of the Japanese Empire by sinking their merchant ships and their oil tankers that linked the Japanese home islands with their main resource territories overseas. Most vitally, their oil supply, which was in the East Indies, present-day Indonesia, Borneo, and Sumatra. They had this 3,000-mile kind of ephemeral artery, and they had to transport the oil from these oil fields back to Japan in these oil tankers. And, you know, our submarines, they were dogged with bad torpedoes for the first half of the war. By the second half of the war, they were essentially annihilating this sea link. And that in itself, really, without anything else, without anything that the carriers did, with the rest of the Navy, without anything the Marines did, the Army, Air Forces, the submarines alone, by late 1944, were essentially on the verge of destroying the Japanese war economy from the inside. And so really what the Pacific War was the single best demonstration in history of what submarines can do to sort of destroy a vital economic lifeline and attack through a death by 1,000 cuts, an ability of a major combatant to wage war. And they paid a tremendous cost, I should say, in doing that. Something on the order of 1 out of every 5 officers and enlisted men who served in submarines in the Pacific lost their lives.
Wow, that's very high. I did not know that. And you could imagine the reason you don't hear as much about it, it's much less of an interesting story than carrier battles on the surface, right? Oh, we sank a tanker in a transport, but absolutely vital in the war.
Yeah, that's part of it. And then it's also worth saying that, you know, the submarine service, for obvious reasons, they tended to keep a very low profile. And so what the submarines were doing was not promoted. There wasn't as much publicity. And so that shaped the perceptions of the American people during the war. And I think that carries over somewhat into history as well.
So I have a question from Christy Wildcat, who is actually a volunteer here. And this is a little bit of a follow-on to a question of what you were talking about before. She says, do you think the Japanese needed to bomb Pearl Harbor, or would they have been better off to skip it altogether?
They'd be better off skipping it altogether. What they could have done, and if they had done it, it would have been created real problems for us. If they had simply declared war on Britain and the Netherlands and bypassed the Philippines, not touched any American base, scrupulously avoided, you know, anything resembling a hostile act toward any American ship or plane or base, and had landed in Malaya, and then had gone on to conquer Malaya, Hong Kong, Burma, as they did, and then the East Indies, and then seize the oil fields in the East Indies. Had they done that, the isolationist movement in the United States, which in many ways was growing stronger in the weeks leading up to Pearl Harbor, would have persisted in, you know, insisting that we stay out of this conflict. You know, why send American boys to fight to defend British colonies in Asia? That would have been the line. So by attacking Pearl Harbor, what they essentially did was they solved FDR's great political problem, which was how to convince the American people of the necessity of joining this war. And it was for that reason one of the greatest blunders in history. In military terms, they knocked our battle fleet out of action. That was a tremendous shock to us at the time. But in the long run, it didn't do too much good in a military sense, because our fully mobilized economy was able to support a counteroffensive in the Pacific as early as mid-1942. And then from that point, it was really just a matter of time.
Answer. Mike Harkleroyd asks, can you comment on the development of Navy logistics forces, eventually allowing 3rd, 5th, and 7th fleets to stay at sea for extended periods, keeping pressure on the Japanese?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is a hugely important part of the story, and you know, I go into it at real length in this trilogy, and particularly in this last book. The issue with logistics is that, well, first of all, I should just say, you know, begin with a map of the Pacific, and you know, you sort of see the problem just by looking at the map. It's the distances, and it's the you know, tiny land masses in the mid-Pacific. And it's the problem of crossing that ocean with enough naval force and air power to be able to directly assault the islands of Japan. And in order to do that, you essentially had to have this 6,000 to 8,000 mile umbilical cord linking the Western Pacific frontiers with San Diego and San Francisco and the Panama Canal. In order to do that, you need an enormous amount of shipping. And so the tremendous sort of success in quickly building a lot of ships, which so much of it happened right there in the Bay Area at Kaiser Shipyards, Marin Ship, and Sausalito. And then also the ability to establish proper fleet bases or functional fleet bases in these kind of remote mid-Pacific atolls, mostly through what we call floating logistics, so floating dry docks and ships that were able to essentially recreate all of the elements of a major shore establishment. And then you had the whole phenomenon of underway replenishment. So ships fueling at sea, taking on provisions at sea, even taking on ammunition at sea eventually. All of that allowing the fleet to extend the duration of its blue water cruises. It's an amazing story. The scale of it is extraordinary. I think for historians and writers telling the story of the Pacific War, often it's been a little elusive to try to tell that story in a way that's really engaging for readers. And so the whole subject of logistics has been fairly dry. And for that reason, it's often been neglected in many Pacific War histories. And you have to go to these kind of tedious, turgid, impenetrable official histories to get the details. So one of the things I've tried to do in this trilogy is try to bring the logistics, particularly naval logistics, back into the heart of the story. And I've done my best to try to do that in a way that's engaging and that uses the techniques of storytelling to keep the reader engaged.
Okay, good. Looking forward to that. Here's a small uncontroversial question that never comes up. Was dropping the atomic bombs absolutely necessary to ensure victory, in your opinion? This is Tom Krizak, who's one of our docents here on the Hornet.
Well, you know, it's. I mean, I agree. That's something that will always be controversial. You know, it's hard to say whether it was absolutely necessary because, of course, you know, we don't have the counterfactual example. We dropped the bombs, the Japanese surrendered. If we hadn't dropped the bombs, they may have surrendered anyway. I think that there are good reasons to think that they would have. But they wouldn't have surrendered as quickly as they did. And so without the bombs, the war would have lasted longer. How much longer? Weeks longer, maybe. The invasion of Kyushu was targeted for November 1st. That's almost 3 months after Hiroshima. We hit Hiroshima on August 6th. That's a long time. And so, you know, that I think is the main reason why many have argued, including the Strategic Bombing Survey that drew, you know, in their official report, this fairly controversial, it was really Paul Nitze was the one who concluded that if we hadn't dropped the atomic bombs, Japan would have surrendered before that invasion. So, yeah, I mean, you know, hard to say. I think really the answer doesn't exist in the archives. If the question is, should we have dropped the atomic bombs? Was it necessary? Was it justified? You know, these are difficult ethical and moral questions. And my own view, and this is really a personal preference rather than me speaking as with the authority of a historian who knows the answer, really me speaking as an individual who has thought it through. I think it was worth trying to use the bombs in a different way, not to drop them on cities initially, but to drop them on purely military targets. And I think there's a good reasons to think the Japanese would have surrendered. Would they have surrendered as quickly? Again, hard to say. I think that they would have surrendered. And I think that in terms of the long-term kind of legacy of the war, I think that's a better look for the United States to have done that, to have hit military targets rather than cities in that case.
It's an interesting perspective that I don't hear a lot of people comment on. And I think you and I were talking about this before it started. It's sort of either or. You either invade or you drop it on the cities, but actually there were other options. And so, yeah, I think there's much more interesting ground for conversation there about what else could you have done, right? Okay, we're about 10 after. Why don't I give you one or two more questions? How does that sound?
Yep.
Okay. So let's see here. Can you comment on the work done by Henry Clausen following the trial of lies about Pearl Harbor? Trail of Lies, sorry. I read that one. Is that from Yuki?
Yes. Oh, no, that's from Chuck.
Oh, that's from Chuck. That's
right.
That's another question from our docent. Are you aware of what he's talking about?
Is this the theory that our government may have been aware that the attack on Pearl Harbor was going to occur?
Is that what this is about?
I don't know. Chuck?
Okay, well, we're not sure, so maybe we'll pass on that one then. Okay. So here's a question from Christy, one of our volunteers again, and she says, who are your favorite military history authors?
Well, boy, I mean, if you're going all the way back to the beginning, Thucydides.
Oh, okay.
Herodotus. How about Theodore Roosevelt? 22 years old. He's a law student at Columbia. And he somehow writes this book, The Naval War of 1812, which was published in, would have been 1882. Was at that time the best book that had ever been written on that subject, in which he had gone through, all of these action reports and essentially untangled exactly what had happened. I mean, that's an extraordinary achievement by someone who, just seemed to be wired differently from the rest of us, Teddy Roosevelt. Winston Churchill, I think, was a great military historian. More recently, writing in the field of the Pacific War, I recommend that everybody read the books of Richard B. Frank, who is also going to be writing a trilogy about the Pacific War. He's a really important historian, and his work has been a major contribution and will be in the future. I think Rick Atkinson is definitely worth reading on the war in Europe as well. So those are a few examples. In general, I'll just add, I think that in many cases, we read a lot of history. There's so many new histories coming out all the time. The best-selling military historians in America right now all seem to have their own cable shows. But a lot of this new work is not really adding all that much. That's the truth. Military history sells well. Because it sells well, publishers keep publishing it. But a lot of stuff that isn't really adding that much does make it to the bookshelves. Don't forget to go back and read some of the stuff that's out of print. And in particular, just one example is, I think war memoirs, particularly war memoirs that were written either during the war or just shortly after the Second World War, they are a tremendous window into the experiences of people who were there, who were writing when their memories were fresh, who were, because they were memoirists, they were sort of a self-selected group, people who in many cases wrote very well. And a lot of those books have become very, very obscure and are not read even by military historians today. But some of them are terrific. I mean, they're really fun reads, and And they're also, really sort of a vital, original records of the war. And there's
Okay,
a bunch of
great.
them that I cite in these books that I've written. They're in the bibliography, and I also, mention them in the course of the text as well.
Great.
See, so just a reminder of buying this book from us.
Yeah, I'm gonna do that. I get one last easy question for you because it's a follow-up. Was Spruance an aviator? I
No,
guess by what you said earlier, no?
Lawrence was not an aviator. He was what they call a black shoe. He had spent his entire career in the surface Navy and serving in battleships and cruisers and destroyers. And he never learned to fly, and he never skippered a carrier.
Oh, okay. All right, well, hey, thanks. That was fantastic. I want to remind everybody that's listening that you can get the latest book, signed copies that we have in our online store. The link is in the Facebook Live event. And I want to thank you so much. That was a great conversation, and I really hope you come to California again soon, and we'll get you on the ship.
I look forward to it.
All right, thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Good night, and
Okay, take care.
we'll talk to you soon. Thank you.
Bye.